This is the YouTube version of the Hidden Experience audio podcast. This show is hosted by Mike Cleland, and that's me, and it is available on most of the popular podcast platforms. Just search out Hidden Experience Audio. And if you want to support the show, you can find it on Patreon, as well as Buy Me a Coffee. This YouTube version has ads, but the audio version is always ad-free. And you can also join my YouTube channel here. And now the show. Audio conversation with Katie Paige, recorded Thursday, September 5th, 2024. Katie and I will be talking about our friend and mentor, the late Dr. Leo Sprinkle. Leo was born August 31st, 1930, and Leo passed away at the age of 91 on November 15th, 2021. Katie wrote a book titled Letters of Love and Light, 4 Decades of UFO Encounters, Experiences, and Sightings Shared with Ufologist R. Leo Sprinkle, Ph.D. This is a collection of letters from the archives of Dr. Sprinkle, a pioneering researcher who studied UFOs and worked to support experiencers for half a century. Leo had a Ph.D. in counseling psychology, and he was dedicated to helping and healing, both emotionally and spiritually. Katie's book was published in 2020, and Leo wrote the foreword. Here are some words of praise for Katie's book. This book not only honors the pioneering work of a great ufologist, but it also provides a robust cross-section of the UFO phenomenon. Katie educates the reader on the diverse nature of the UFO reports that researchers receive, as well as the obstacles in investigating them. She also is keen on exploring the deep emotional impact these experiences have on the individual. These transformative experiences are a driving force, compelling witnesses to seek out answers, context, and emotional support. Dr. Leo Sprinkle has been that man who has helped provide this to so many people over the decades, armed with a sharp, insightful mind and a warm and generous heart. This was written by David Marler, a UFO researcher and historian. Katie Paige is Colorado MUFON's state director. She is also the host of MUFON's What's Up radio broadcast. She also appears on the History Channel's Beyond Skinwalker Ranch. Katie has recently been focused on the Rocky Mountain Ranch, a site in Colorado with a long history of paranormal happenings and high strangeness. Katie has personal ties to this Colorado ranch. She visited there as a young girl, and this is what has motivated her interest in the UFO mystery, to find answers to her own personal experiences. We talk about this during the show. And let me add that I needed to do this show. It was an honor to take this time to talk about Leo and his decades of ceaseless work. It was a joy to have spent time with him, and equally joyous to reminisce and honor his memory and the important role he played in UFO history. I interviewed Leo in 2011 in the earlier incarnation of the Hidden Experience podcast, and that episode will be linked in the show notes. One quick note, and I will follow up on this at the end after the interview. I made a mistake during the setup for this show, and my side of the audio isn't as clear as I usually strive for. It's not bad, but I have high standards for myself and high standards for this show. Okay, enough about that. Katie and I spent about an hour and 20 minutes praising a big-hearted soul, Leo Sprinkle. Please enjoy. Katie, I want to thank you so much for saying yes to this interview. It means a lot to me.
Well, thank you, Mike. I'm glad to be here. And of course, the topic means a lot to me as well. So anytime we can talk about our dear common friend, Dr. Leo Sprinkle, I am happy to do it.
Great. You wrote a book that is called Letters of Love and Light, 4 Decades of UFO Encounters, Experiences, and Sightings Shared with Ufologist R. Leo Sprinkle, Ph.D., and that was published in 2020, which wasn't that long ago. So what was the genesis of this book?
Well, the first time I knew about the fact that the Colorado ranch that my family and I spent time on as a young girl in the mid to late 70s. This was from 75 to 78 was the height of this incredible activity out there on this Rocky Mountain ranch. Linda Moulton Howe was an investigative journalist at the time, reporting on the rash of cattle mutilations out there in Elbert County and other places, other locations, San Luis Valley in Colorado. And so my mother was dating a gentleman that owned this high strangeness ranch. And we were basically threatened and warned never to talk about what happened out there. And I joined MUFON in 2012 and went in right as a field investigator. I picked up a book a year later called Hunt for the Skinwalker by George Knapp and Colm Kelleher.
Sure.
Yeah, in that book is a chapter called Other Hotspots. And that's where I learned of Dr. Leo Sprinkle, that he was one of the investigators that actually went on location and investigated the Rocky Mountain Ranch. He was with APRO, which is the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization, precursor to MUFON, really. So Dr. Leo Sprinkle was out there on the ranch, along with Peter Van Arsdale, Ph.D., and John Durr, Ph.D. One was a seismologist. So I kind of initially went out. As we know, Dr. Leo Sprinkle was a psychologist and worked out of Laramie, Wyoming. So for me, it was a quick 2.5-hour drive over to the Heritage Center where he has his archives, all his research stored. And Leo is old school, right? So I wrote him a letter. My state director, Doug Wilson, at the time had his contact information. I wrote Dr. Leo a letter stating who I was and my connection to the Rocky Mountain Ranch. Wanted to verify that was indeed the right location, because in the APRA report and UFO folklore, it was known as a Clearview Ranch. They didn't have the actual name of the families. The names were changed in any of the reports, but I knew the location and the names. And Leo, in good old-fashioned Leo style, responded so quickly with a wonderful letter verifying that, yes, this is the ranch, this is the location. And a week later, I was sitting in his office. Yeah.
Great. So I said as much in the introduction, but to clarify now for anyone listening, Leo passed on in 2021.
He did.
And you and I talked on the phone shortly after that, and I said, we need to do a podcast. I want to do a podcast. At the time, I wasn't hosting a podcast. Pretty much the reason I started the podcast again was to do this very interview in honor of Leo. Because Leo meant a lot to me. He was the first person I really reached out to. Mm-hmm. So I know just what it means to get the paper letter from Leo or get the phone call from Leo.
Right.
So, and that would have been for me. I was in active contact with him from around 2006, 7 through probably around 2014.
Oh, wow. So you know how prompt he is. And I mean, I'm sure with you, as it was for me and so many people around the world, what ended up happening, I go to the American Heritage Center to pull the box that had the ranch documents and information in there. And what happened was there were 72 boxes filled with correspondence and research from Dr. Leo Sprinkle, and I got lost in these letters from people all around the world. And what struck me the most was that Leo had kept all his return correspondence because he would type them out or had his secretary type them out, and he kept the copies of them. Mm-hmm. So for me, it became this journey. It was a 3-year project where I just kept going back and forth to the archives, and I'd spend the weekends and just photograph hundreds of letters. And then I'd get to spend time with Leo, so that was an added bonus. Because as you know, he was so gracious with his time, and he would just sit and chat with you for an hour, 2 hours, and actually listen to you. And I think that really sums up the man. And he had this great sense of humor, yeehaw. And and he let me interview him, and I had so many questions for him, and we can get to that in a little bit. But what was cool for me was his archives and his correspondence and his response letters that he kept, it was kind of a paper trail of his thought processes through the 50s, through the 60s, through the 70s, through the 80s, through the 90s. And not only was he talking to experiencers, but he was talking to his colleagues and even the non-believers. Like there's a whole folder in there on correspondence with Phil Klass, right, who was a really well-known debunker. And reading how Dr. Sprinkle handled people like Phil Klass taught me a lot as a researcher, as an investigator, and as a person. And reading hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters that people wrote to Leo, it was fascinating to me because Leo was a psychologist to kind of learn how he dealt with, because you can get a tone of a letter. And that's another thing I loved, right? Old-fashioned letter writing is kind of long gone. We're texting, everything's emails, but he would get letters 10, 15 pages long, front and back, and people who had corresponded with him for years, if not decades. So some people had 2, 3, 4 just thick files of correspondence. And what struck me, Dr. Sprinkle responded all the time to all these people, letter after letter after letter. I'm thinking, how does this man have the time to do that? And, and the wherewithal to do it. But I mean, it was inspiring, it was really inspiring to see that.
So I'm at the receiving end of these similar letters because I'm putting out the word, like, I want to hear your owl stories. And sadly, it is a lot of work. I can't get back to everyone. I just can't get back to everyone.
Oh, I know.
And so that's so heartening to hear that, because he certainly got back to me. And I was kind of surprised. I would jot off a little note, or I would send So oftentimes I would call and leave a message at the clinic in Laramie.
Yeah.
And then I would get a paper letter back within a day or so.
I know.
Or whatever it would be, like a few days later. I was in Idaho, so that didn't take long for the mail to get there.
But can you imagine just doing that 1,000 times over? I mean, thousands and thousands of people from around the world. I'm just like
50 years.
50 years worth of him corresponding. And there's so many of those letters that I found in those files that were just unnoticed or, just kind of went by the wayside. And then to see his responses and how he dealt with people, because it runs the gamut, right? And I think the book that he did, Soul Samples, Personal Explorations in Reincarnation and UFO Experiences, this was a huge body of work for him. And really, Leo was a pioneer in that. And I did this too, I searched Dr. Leo Sprinkle's name and looked at the archives of newspaper clippings. And he took a lot of heat back in the day because he would go to local school districts, elementary schools, middle schools around Wyoming and even Colorado. One of the personal kind of stories, I was married at the time. My ex-husband has a sister, and I'm just going through the letters, just digging through, and there was a letter from my ex-husband's sister to Dr. Leo Sprinkle thanking him for coming to her middle school and talking about Snippy the horse. And so I'm like, I can't believe I found a letter from my sister-in-law in Dr. Leo's files, because there were letters from children and drawings from children. But his book, Soul Samples, really, he kind of took a lot of heat, and he was trying to say and prove through testing and other, surveys that all experiences aren't crazy, right?
Yes.
A lot of just average, high-educated, normal people are having very unusual experiences. And so he did this soul sample study where the data is, it's phenomenal. Very few people are, labeled crazy. We're all pretty sane and tested pretty normal. So,
well, he was a clinician first.
Yes.
He was a therapist first,
right,
and a researcher second.
Yep.
Yeah. And I have that book, Soul Samples. We talked about that a little bit before we started the recording. I wish I had that to prep this interview because I read it back in the early 2000s.
Right.
And it's in storage right now.
Right. He goes through here like on page 137. I just happened to open up here. So thank you, Leo. And I have another personal Leo story I'll tell you in a little bit. But he goes through the characteristics of UFO contactees. So through his research and studies, they seem to be average, normal people in their social and psychological functioning. They seem to be highly susceptible to hypnotic suggestion, meaning they get hypnotized easy. They have a lot of psychic phenomenon or possess some psychic abilities. They exhibit loving concern for all humankind. So he would do these studies and look for commonalities between experiencers. It's a fascinating book, and I'm sure you could still get it on Amazon out there. I hope anyway.
You sure can. I looked this morning.
Yeah, I highly recommend it because it's really interesting, the work that went into this.
Yeah, so here, I'll tell you how I met Leo. I was living in Idaho. This would have been around 2006-07, probably 2007. And I was going through some experiences, and I had a series of events in my life that sure sounded like UFO abduction, missing time events and close-up UFO sightings. And there was a time when I was a young man when I woke up and looked out my window, and there were 5 gray aliens walking towards the house, skinny beings walking towards the house. And I was in bed. The way the bed was, I could look right out the window, and I just heard this voice in my head that said, now is the time to put your head on the pillow and shut down. And I just laid down. But they were backlit by this big, big, bright light that, as if there was a source of a big, bright light in the yard. And I figured out a way to just deny all of it and ignore all of it and would not let myself entertain the implications of what all this meant. And then around that time, I just couldn't push it down. There were other things happening too in the form of synchronicities. So I called up MUFON. So 2007 or 8, I called up MUFON. And so I was right on the Idaho-Wyoming border. So I called up Idaho and nobody returned my call. I called Wyoming, nobody returned my call. The state directors, I don't know what's going on now, but at the time it was like, there was no way to get a hold of anyone. So I can't remember if I reached out to someone else or another state director. And then finally someone got back to me and I said, listen, I think I've experienced like UFO contact. I think I've been abducted and I don't know what to do. I'm kind of freaking out. And the guy on the other end of the phone said, well, there's nothing we can do. Like, what are you calling us for? And then I contacted some other people, and finally someone said, who you should talk to? You should talk to Leo Sprinkle.
Yeah.
And I had heard of him. And now I said, okay, that's great. So I literally looked him up in the phone book, and I think I called the office in Laramie, and he got back to me right away and said, well, come on in. So I drove, it's a long drive from Idaho to Laramie. It's on the other side of the state. So I showed up at his office, and we talked and talked and talked. And this is, and I was like so tied up in knots, and just story after story after story, and these things were just rolling out of me. And kind of at the end of our time, I kind of said, I don't think I have UFO contact experiences. And he like slapped his thigh, and he like laughed as loud as he could. He just he just roared from the belly. And I was just like, oh gosh. So I've told that to people, that story to other people. And they gave me this look like, that's terrible. That is incredibly rude that like a therapist would do that. And I'm like, oh no, you don't get it. Like he sized me up. He sized me up. He had just the instinct, and he knew, he's like, okay, I got to do exactly the right thing. And the exactly right thing was to laugh in my face. And it was so endearing. Yeah. And it was so like, it wasn't like he was laughing like he was being mean. He was really like big hearted. And so I drove back home, and Leo would then send me, every once in a while, he'd either call me or send me a note and say, you should talk to this person. Call this person up. Here's their phone number. I had no idea. Call them up. And then it was great. It was great. These people had these amazing, similar experiences. Right. And this was also very on in my early, like, during this time I was seeing a lot of owls, and I was seeing a lot of owl synchronicities, and this owl stuff was like making itself known synchronistically in my life. So I would ask these initial people, right? Like the very first phone calls, I would talk to people, the people who had the contact experience. And I'd say, have you had any odd experiences with owls? And it was right away. Oh yeah, I got some weird stories. You want to hear some weird stories? And they would tell me the most bizarre, like almost absurdly bizarre stories involving owls. So 2 things were happening at the same time. I was researching myself, trying to better understand what had happened to me, or seeking help through Leo. And then I was also, like, first day I was asking the owl question. And it felt so great to talk to people like unfiltered, like someone who shared the experience. And Leo had a great like sixth sense to, oh, you would be a good fit to talk with this person. And so that was so helpful for me in that early chapter of me trying desperately to come to terms with what I sensed was happening, but wow, I did not want to go there. And he framed it as like a journey, as a challenge, as an opportunity to grow spiritually and intellectually, and just widen your horizons of thought, and it was super helpful. So I'm just incredibly grateful to have not only known him, but to have him work with me as I was struggling. I feel like I'm much more at peace now. I am much more at peace now, but wow, I was a mess back then. So he was a great mentor and a great listening ear.
Right. And that's something that really impressed upon me as well. His generosity of time, but also he always had, and you're right, he had this intuitive knowing of, reach out to this person and reach out to this person. And he had, he'd reach into his drawer and have on the ready, copies of his work or a paper you should read. And he also, my daughter, she was a senior in high school at the time, and she went with me one weekend to research. And he said, do you mind if I channel a little bit about your daughter? And so he did a channeling, and a lot of people don't know that Leo had that gift of channeling and that intuitive side to him. And then in channeling my daughter, I mean, she still remembers it. She's 24 now. And she's like, remember when Leo, and the thing that stuck out for her, and I just think it was just Leo wisdom. Because, when you're in high school and you're getting ready to go to college and you kind of have an idea how you want your life to be or where you want it to go. And he told her that he saw this great ball of positive love energy, like her destination, but there were so many different roads to get there. But she could be rest assured that if she follows her heart and her intuition, and that these different paths will ultimately lead her to her goals if she keeps those goals in her mind, and set. So he was just like, I was just sitting there loving it as a mother of a teenage daughter.
Were you right in his office?
Yeah, we were right there in his office.
Okay.
And she still remembers that. So he just had this intuitive gift of giving you the right information or having you connect with the right people. And it was just so wonderful, to have that. And you're right. For me and all the things I experienced as a kid, he was the first one that there was no judgment there. And I'm sure he heard it all through the decades, Mm-hmm. He heard it all. And he had a way of, letting you just sit with your own experiences and not pass judgment on it in good Leo style, yeehaw, he'd always say yeehaw and would laugh and smile. And just, there's nobody quite like him,
And he was at the center of such a rich chapter of UFO history in America. I mean, mm-hmm. he knew Hynek. He was involved in the Condon Report. And if I'm not mistaken, he dropped out of the Condon Report.
Yeah.
When he recognized that there were like ethical issues, that they weren't doing honest research, essentially.
Right. He did.
So, and there was all kinds of like you go through the list of important UFO events between like the 50s and the 80s, and he's right there.
Right.
Do you remember the TV show In Search of with Leonard Nimoy?
Yes.
There's an episode where Leo is working with the abductee, and I can't remember the fellow. He was the fellow that had his car got lifted up in Wyoming, I think it was.
The Carl Higdon case.
Yes, where he shot the gun 3 times.
The elk. Yeah.
He was elk hunting, but he actually shot and when one of the bullets like came out in slow motion and just kind of plopped on the ground.
Right. Yeah, just last week I went to the archives. I pulled all the Carl Higdon information out of Dr. Sprinkle's archives, all the original photographs, the medical reports, everything is there. So we went to Rawlins, stayed, and we were within a mile of the Higdon site because he had to hike back into where he actually was when he shot at the elk. Mm-hmm. And he encountered a ET called Asa 1, and he shot his rifle at the elk, and you're right, he's like, it was in slow motion. It hit an invisible like box or force, and the bullet fell, and he was floated these food pills, ingested one of the food pills. The truck was moved to a different location from where he originally parked it. Long story short, he was taken on this journey, missing time, went right to the hospital there in Rollins, and he had burns to the eyes and other physical effects. He had amnesia for 3 days. He was hospitalized for 3 days. It's a really interesting case, but Dr. Sprinkle was at the forefront of that. And you're right, you can watch these older documentaries, and Carl Higdon's a good example of that. If you just Google search a Carl Higdon case, chances are there'll be an interview with Dr. Sprinkle there. And so many times he'll just pop up in, certain documentaries or whatever. I'm like, there's Leo. Mm-hmm. So yeah, he was at the forefront for sure in so many cases.
Yeah. Yeah. This would have been around 2017 or so. I hadn't talked to Leo in a while, and I was kind of worried. I mean, I knew he was getting older, so I called up his office, and I said, "Hey, is Leo there?" And I was just talking to some secretary and said, "No, Leo's not here today." And so and I kind of was hemming and hawing. And finally, I just said, "I know Leo. I worked with him a few years ago. How's he doing?" And this lady said, "Oh, he's wonderful." And you could just hear the emotion in her voice. "Oh, he's wonderful. He puts his suit on. He comes in. He's not working with clients presently, but he comes in once a week and walks around the office and checks things out and says hello to everyone." And that clinic is kind of a big building with a lot of offices. And there's the library in the basement with all the UFO books and the paranormal books. But I remember, like, he would walk down the hall, and it was mostly just like family therapists, but there was also like Reiki therapists and massage therapists, and in more non-traditional forms of therapy were also represented you could just on the little name tags of the doors as you walked around the halls. But when Leo would walk by, or Leo was walking down the hall and people were there was a look people gave him, and it was palpable. And I've seen it at UFO conferences too, where he'll walk by and people who knew who he was would just looked at him with such reverence. I sat with Linda Moulton Howe, at one point at a conference, and I was trying to explain, that was in the chapter of my life when I was really like anxious and like, help me. And so she was nice, very patient and listening to me. But then Leo walked by and her attention was completely off me, and she just watched him walk by like a saint had walked through the room.
Yeah.
And so I saw that in innumerable people.
Yeah, for sure. And he's a rare gift, and that's how I see him, and I think about him pretty much every day. Because when I first interviewed him for the book, and I thought where you were going with your story, I thought you were going to say I was so concerned and worried because up till the end, he would compete in the Senior Olympics. And the last time I saw him for like a long visit, he had won all the gold in every category, and he was laughing. He's like, "Wow, I was the only one who showed up in my age division." But he's like, I won the sprint, I won the swimming, I won the this, I won. And then he would win all the gold medals, and he'd give the medals back to recycle them. He goes, "Well, I guess I'm going to win them all next year." And
he told me that too. Yeah, he felt playing basketball. He was very tall.
Yes. So yeah, we worried about Leo, but he's out there playing basketball at his age. He kept in really good shape, and he was very proud of his Olympics and his gold medals. And another thing a lot of people don't know about him, and I told him I might do this, and I'll contact his daughter to see if it's a possibility. But Leo had pages and hundreds of pages of limericks. And he was brilliant at writing limericks. Oh. And I would love to see those published. So they're shared with the world. So that might be another Katie Paige project here eventually. But yeah, so he was in really good shape. And unfortunately, that nasty C word, got him there at the end.
Yeah. Yeah. And you visited him near the end, didn't you? In the hospital?
I did. Yeah, I would call it that intuitive feeling when he went into like more hospice care. Both him and his beloved Marilyn, they were in rooms right next to each other. That was really hard to see. And just recently when I went back to do the Carl Higdon, we went by the cemetery there in Laramie where he is laid to rest now. And I saw that Marilyn had passed. So they're together in love and light. And I was happy because, you know, he always referred to her as his beloved Marilyn. But I did see him right before he passed. I brought him some UFO magazines and put his little beanie on his head. And I just wanted him to know that the UFO community was thinking about him, that we all loved and cared for him. And it was a really, really nice visit. And he passed shortly thereafter. But before he passed, he wrote me a letter. And it's in a frame along with our picture with a little western border. So you have the Wyoming feel of the cowboys and that. And I live up here in near Woodland Park behind Pikes Peak. So we're in a high fire area. Mm-hmm. Maybe once a year we'll get evacuated for a potential fire. And one of the very first things I pack in my Jeep is this letter. It's one of my cherished things that I have. And if I can I read it? What he wrote to me?
Absolutely, yes.
So it's dated January 19th, 2021. He says, "Dear Katie, thank you so much for the package that arrived today. Thank you for the copy of your book. And thank you for focusing on the many letters received over the years and for focusing on Leo's work." Like how you are a jewel, and I am grateful to receive this book. I love you. May the book go well. Sales and reviews. Love and light, Leo. So I know that, you know, this book project on Leo's work meant a lot to him. And anytime that I can bring him up, you know, I just don't want him to be forgotten, you know, and seeing his journey in the field, that's one of the very first questions I asked him. I'm like, you know, you've been in the field for over 40 years. You've been on this journey. You're getting near the end of your life. At the time he knew, you know, how sick he was. I said, do you have any regrets? Do you have any advice for me as a researcher and an investigator in this field? And in good Leo fashion, he slapped his knee and yeehaw. He said he had no regrets. And for him, it really wasn't about finding the answers. It was about the journey in meeting all the wonderful people and the correspondence and the friendships and the adventures. And he just, if you keep your heart and your motives and intentions in the right place, focus on the journey and have a good time and cherish your friendships. And I keep that with me all the time.
Yeah, and so that was actually a question I want to ask is for the show notes, and this is a very private picture, there's a picture of you and Leo, like literally he's in his hospital bed.
Yeah.
And he's smiling, and I think you said at the time he wasn't talking.
No, he was, it's a sweet, bittersweet memory for me, but, you know, I gave him some UFO magazines and some newsletters I had for him and had a very nice, but he had very little energy. Like I knew 20 minutes he was exhausted and his little beanie had fallen behind his pillow and he couldn't find it. So I put his beanie on his head, kissed him on his forehead. And, you know, it was just right before he passed. And he still managed to have that smile on his face. And I was very, very happy that I was able to deliver that message for the community at large. And he was happy to receive it. So, you know, he hung in with that smile to the very end. And he's really impacted my life. And on a very personal note, shortly after he passed, I was asked to do a conference in Sedona, Arizona. Mm-hmm. And I was struggling with some things at the conference. There were some issues, and I was just having a hard time. It was... They had a dinner in another little nearby town, and I had gotten lost, and there was just some issues with sound and other things, and I was crying. I found my way back to my Airbnb. I was crying. I was upset. I'm thinking, boy, I don't know if I can present in the morning. I was the first speaker the next morning. I was really feeling like I just wanted to go home at that point. And I had tossed my cell phone on the foot of the bed at the Airbnb, and I'm up on the headboard, just sitting there crying and having a tough time to gather my senses. My phone started ringing, and it was Dr. Leo Sprinkle. And he had already passed.
Oh, he was, wow, okay.
Mm-hmm. And I just started laughing. I'm just like, oh my gosh. And immediately I had this like telepathic message in my head, and I knew it was from Leo because he was calling me on my phone, even though he had already passed. And I just said out loud to myself, and I said, you're right, I'll do it. I need to follow through and do my presentation in the morning. So I got up the next morning, there was some issues with the sound. Ron James, the filmmaker.
Oh, I know Ron.
Yeah, he lived a couple miles from the venue. And so I called him. I'm like, I have a lot of sound in my presentation. He goes, don't worry, take a deep breath. I have a Bluetooth speaker, come and get it. Got it all hooked up, got everything working like last minute, pulled it all together, gave a wonderful presentation. And I met a little boy named Kai and his mother and his father. And I knew in that moment, I'm like, okay, Leo, I know why I had to continue on and follow through with this and get it done, because I met Kai, and very special kid. And actually, Kai's drawings were almost identical to some of the drawings that were in Dr. Leo Sprinkle's folders from children, that children would draw him things. So I actually use it in some of my presentations, that link. But I'll never forget that time. And it was as if Leo on the other side was like, no, Katie, you're not quitting. Get up and get it done. And I did. So, he's still around in spirit. I definitely feel him all the time.
Yeah. There was a tough side to him too.
Yeah.
And I saw that. My book came out. My first book came out in 2015. It's on the right on the cover. It says "The Messengers" is the title, and underneath it says "Owls, Synchronicity, and the UFO Abductee." And I was really proud of it. I sent that book to him. He got back to me right away with a letter and said, but he basically said, you should not use the word abductee. You should use the word inductee, because the implications of abduction is being taken away, and induction means being pulled towards something. You are inducted into the army. If you were abducted, it is a crime. The abductor is a criminal. So, and it was like, I was just like, whoa, oops, my hero, basically I could see in his role as a teacher at the University of Wyoming. I mean, he held people to very high standards. Yeah. In the follow-up letters, he was very, very complimentary about the book itself. But I could just tell he had to get that out and had to say it, and he was very firm in his delivery. So
I take it you didn't change it though.
I did not change it. Once it was published, I can't really change it. But and I do talk about that, the fact that I bet you I wouldn't say that now, but it represented where I was at that point. And I talk about it in the book too, how that word is very loaded. It's right there in the book. I discuss the baggage that's associated with that word, abduction and abductee and abductor.
Right.
So, but wow, he was, I didn't take any offense to it. And actually it was a really nice thing for me because my immediate reaction was just what I said. I could see him being a strong presence in a classroom. Yeah. So.
Yeah. That's a good way to kind of ease into something really interesting I found, while I was doing the book project with him. But through all his inventories that he did on inductees.
The contact experience, yeah.
Yeah, the contact experience. He came up with an acronym called PAX. And he found it to be kind of a common journey that a lot of experiencers, inductees and contactees go through. And I'll just read them if that's okay.
Absolutely.
And this is Dr. Sprinkle's PAX. He saw everybody's journey and he's like, wow, these all seem pretty familiar time and time again. And so the P stood for preparation, childhood visitation by strange spiritual beings, lucid dreams or precognitive dreams of possible future events, psychic experiences like telepathy, clairvoyance, seeing auras, etc. And then the A stands for, and interesting, he calls it abduction.
Oh, good for him. Good for him.
Abduction. So UFO sightings and or UFO abduction experiences, loss of time experiences, or partial amnesia events taken aboard spacecraft by spiritual beings or UFO entities, unexplained body marks, scars, emotional reactions like why me, feeling of being drafted for some unexplained purpose.
Yes.
The C stood for contact, adult visitations by spiritual beings or spiritual guides, mental messages about a duty or a mission, psychic experiences, telepathy, clairvoyance, PK, healing, etc., lucid dreams and or precognitive dreams of possible futures, emotional reactions, why me, purpose of visitations, feeling of volunteering for a special mission or task. So then the T, he says, stood for training. And this is kind of interesting because I feel like so many of us go through this T phase, which is obsessive compulsive behaviors,
Yes.
reading, traveling, visions, reading various materials, including uninteresting material, a change in your personality, feeling of being monitored, implanted, like a thirst for knowledge, a review of possible past lives. So like watching all the documentaries, I think a lot of us go through this phase where we're just gobbling up information. And sometimes that could take years, right? I mean, I went through like the tuning forks, the crystals, the remote viewing, all of the things, right? And that's kind of that T. And then the final one is, and I feel like I'm in this right now, and I believe you are too, Mike, which is the S, which stands for service. Channeling verbal or written information from spiritual beings, spiritual guides, serving as a messenger by conducting research, talking to others, providing instruction or healing and or assistance to others, working to minimize planetary difficulties, giving assistance to humankind, feeling that one knows his or her task or purpose in life. So Leo's kind of premise was, you kind of walk into his office a lot like you did, feeling like, help me, I'm going through this experience. I don't know how to make heads or tails of it. And you come out and you go through this process. And at the end, you almost feel empowered, like, okay, I get it now. I know what I need to be doing, and that comes through his love and light, helping others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as you were going through that list, it wasn't everything, but it was a lot that I could say, yep, that's me. Yeah.
Right.
And he's coming from a place of 50 years of essentially staying on the same track of this research. As a clinician, I just listened to an interview I did with him in 2011. I listened to it just this morning as I got up. There's a walk I do. And I went on this walk and I listened to it as I was walking. I hadn't heard it in a long time. And it was really bittersweet. And it was interesting because I could hear in my own voice, where I was at that chapter of my life and compared to where I am now. And so I asked him a question, which was kind of what I was sensing at the time. It has since been confirmed through other people who have done actually statistical work on this. But I was basically saying, my sense is that it's about 60% of the people who claim the contact experience have a positive experience, and about 40% have a negative experience. Other researchers have come up with different numbers, but they're right in that ballpark. Because I was asking him about he's basically been doing he's been on the same track for 50 years doing this research. He said, what have you found? Anything interesting you've seen as a pattern? And he said something I thought was marvelous. He said, the people who believe in reincarnation that have the contact experience have a positive experience. The people who don't believe in reincarnation have a negative experience. And I think he was absolutely genuine as far as crunching the numbers and following through on that. So I found that it's like that reincarnation is outside the boundaries of the nuts and bolts UFO researcher, right? The people who are doing, that are studying Tic Tacs, that are following Navy jets and stuff like that, don't ask about reincarnation. And I feel strongly they should. They should ask about reincarnation and psychic abilities and a sense of mission and all the things that you listed there that are more esoteric. You knew him, and we both knew him, and there were very few researchers even now that are taking that extra step and really going there with that kind of research.
Right. I think he was well ahead of his time. And, reincarnation was his second love, right? Hypnosis and reincarnation. And I mean, he's an old soul, and hence his, soul samples. And something else that he'd always talk to me about, and I can't remember the name of the book, darn it, but he was really he talks about a story when he was younger, and it kind of talks about, he talks about being in elementary school and some bullies came up and wanted to fight him. And he's like, I don't want to fight. Like, he's not a fighter, right? He's kind of a lover, not a fighter. And how he kind of maneuvered his way through that. And later they became best friends and all this stuff. But something he always said was like, he was a champion for women. women in the field, women in, he'd always say, Katie, we're going to have a female president someday, and we're going to, there's so many more females in CEO positions, and until humanity can learn to love one another and hold both males and females and everybody all up, he was just a champion for that. And he really felt like we were never going to ascend and be part of the galactic, invited into the galactic world until humans kind of get their stuff together, right?
Yeah.
And he was about Tesla energy and free energy. And so he had, all these different little flyers he'd give you. And he really believed in all that. He really wanted this more loving, giving world that, as we know, is sometimes a rough road, right now. So just amazing. He was very much ahead of his time when it comes to, like you were mentioning, the positive and negative aspects to it. And when I talked to him about that, because when I'm 9 to 12 years old and I'm dealing with high strangeness things at the ranch, it was quite frightening to me.
Oh, yeah.
And I wanted to ask him, like, what does this mean? What are these shadow beings? And, it was a pretty terrifying experience. But like you had mentioned, even those 40% that may have had a bad experience with a contact experience, oftentimes as time goes by, you will find it kind of turns into a positive experience where it leads you to a positive place. And it does open up certain psychic gifts and abilities that we seem to be tapped into. And he did a lot of research on that. And some of the things he found is in that book. And he speaks directly to that. And I know, like, this disassociation piece has been studied since the Freudian days, right? Where people that can disassociate, whether it's through remote viewing or near-death experience or meditation or trauma, they do have a more reported experiences with the paranormal or unknown. And he was well ahead of his time in researching that piece of it.
And that's something that's still ignored with some contempt in some circles too. Like, don't go there.
Yeah.
A lot of people dismissed him because he would use terms like the Galactic Federation, and he would sign his letters, love and light. And he was saying, we're on the threshold of being galactic citizens. We are no longer going to be citizens of the Earth. We are at the threshold of being citizens of the universe.
Right.
And a lot of people just didn't have the patience for that. And I think it was in Soul Samples, and I'm doing this from memory, but I think I'm doing this pretty clearly. I read something he wrote, and he basically said, people ask me, they say, hey, Leo, why do you always see everything in such a positive way? As a researcher, you should be more objective. And I say, you're absolutely right. But it just feels better doing it this way. Yeehaw.
Yeehaw.
Which was such a perfect little Leoism, just to say, like, yeah, but just this feels better doing it this way.
Right. And I think that's what I take away from him the most is he did have a positive outlook on everything, really. And I'm sure he had his moments like we all do. We're all human. But to see him interact through his letters, through his readings, and how he handled people with such grace and dignity. And he would say, even if he was skeptical of somebody's experience, he would say, I believe that you believe it, right? And just handle it with grace, and maybe it gets, he doesn't focus on that case. But he always handled everybody with grace and dignity. And I think there's a lesson for all of us in that. So,
something I learned from him, which is, so he told a story and I heard him tell it. He told it to me directly at one point. I don't think it was on the interview. I just listened to that this morning. He did not tell it there, but I've heard him tell it a few times. And he said, I had a woman come to me and she felt she had a contact experience. And she said, Leo, there's only one day it could have happened. There's only one day it could have happened. It was the day I was driving from this town to this town. It was on that road. That's the only time it could have happened. And so Leo said, okay, well, let's go through a regression and see what we find out. So he puts her through the induction process of going into the subconscious and goes, puts her under hypnosis and takes her to the time on the road. And she's driving down the road. And so the thing was that there was no missing time.
Okay.
Because the trip lasted just the right amount of time. So she said, I should have been on this day I was driving, but there was nothing wrong with the day I was driving because the trip took just as long as it should have taken. So she's driving down the road. Then there's a ET craft that hovers right above the car. And then this beam of light comes down and goes right into the car, like right through the windshield. And then on this beam of light, like an escalator, comes this gray alien. She's driving, on the highway. This ET being comes down the beam of light, comes into the car, gets into the driver's seat, starts driving, and then this woman gets on the same beam of light and takes the escalator ride up into the craft and has a whole contact experience as the ET is driving her car.
Huh.
And then Leo says, I don't know what to make of that, but it's a marvelous story.
Right. That is a great story.
And I'm like, because it's on one sense, it's impossible to believe. Like,
Yeah.
what? A little gray being is like driving the car down like I-80 between like Laramie and Brock Springs. What are you talking about? But at the same time, so that was something I really learned, is to just like, if you're confronted with something that's like, whoa, like that's a lot to take in, just to be able to back off and say, that was a marvelous story. Mm-hmm. And that really helped me a lot because I really struggled with that aspect for a long time initially, where I just couldn't. I was being too literal. Like the logical side of my brain said, "Oh, that's just, I can't make that seem real."
Right. I have that same thing where I have that logical side too. But Art Bell was another champion of that, right? He would invite people on to tell their experiences and their stories, and that's how he presented it. Like, believe it or not, but
yeah.
So, yeah.
So, how are you doing? How are you holding up? We've been at it for just about an hour now.
Yeah, doing good.
We've spoken a handful of times before, and you've said some things that I sensed strongly that you've had your own, some sort of experiences in your life, and the work you're doing and the dedication you have to the work you're doing. So I make this assumption with a lot of people in this field, and it's kind of not fair to assume. So I'm just going to ask, do you feel you've had any kind of like contact experiences in your life?
Yeah, that's a fair question. And I think like so many people that have had just anomalous experiences that they can't explain, they question that. And I've questioned that for most of my life. I very much lucid dream all the time. I interact and play with my dreams. I have interesting memories of some things and just some other unusual little things that I talked privately with Dr. Sprinkle about. And so he asked me if, do you mind having a hypnosis session with me? And I thought, well, if nothing else, I'm curious about hypnosis. I've never been through the process. And I had the old stereotypical, where they are, I get rocking something in front of your eyes back and forth, like watch the marble or watch the, but it wasn't like that, right? So I'm in his office and we close the blinds and get in a relaxed state, and he does this process where you're going down, and he said I could either choose an elevator or an escalator. I chose the escalator method, and he just takes you down into a deep meditative state, and he says you can choose to have your eyes open or you could choose to have them closed. I chose to keep mine closed, and I was under for about an hour and 20 minutes. And it took me a week to listen back to the cassette recording of it. I was I don't know how I feel about what I've said because, I sort of remembered some things, but to listen back to it was quite the experience. It was a positive experience for me. What I found fascinating about it is I had mentioned at the top of the show that we were pretty much told not to talk about what was happening out there on the ranch. And so my sister and I actually came up with our own like pig Latin secret language that we would talk to each other about things that were happening. But I never did talk to my mom or any of the other adults. So through the hypnosis process with Leo, the first 15, 20 minutes of that session was the little girl Katie, finding her voice, to stand up to, like, I brought up my mother and my mother's boyfriend and these other adults that were telling me not to talk about it. So from a psychological standpoint, that made a lot of sense to me, that I had to like find that little, like I had to get permission to talk about it.
Is it?
The little Katie in me. And then the other interesting part for me was my voice kind of turned into a little girl's voice, and I was using very childlike language where I was going and like and like and like, and then I said, and I wasn't scared, and my voice like shook and sounded like really young. And I talk about being behind a big panel of like transparent, like a transparent window, and I was talking about how the ETs around me were tall, they were soft, and they were blue. One was a little shorter than the other, and the one that was shorter was a little more playful. The taller one was more serious and knowledgeable, but they were loving and kind around me as I was looking through this window. And on the other side, I was seeing a big field, very colorful, vivid colors, and there were children playing. And I said they were hybrid children. And in that hypnosis, I said that they were creating hybrid children because that those particular ETs became like a well-oiled machine. And that's the words that came out in my hypnosis. They're like well-oiled machines, and they lost certain parts of their individuality, and they're doing a hybrid program to hybrid with humans to get more of their individuality and personalities back, because as you know, we're wonderful musicians and artists, and we're kind of a bipolar species. We can be happy one day and sad the next, and they're trying to find this perfect balance between being very functional and no disease and sicknesses and pain and hurt, but yet still have some, human individualistic kind of parts to their personality, so they're not all the same. Like you hear about the grays or the tall grays, and they're almost sort of robotic or AI. So that's what came out of hypnosis from me, that they're well-oiled machines. And I was in the hypnosis, I'm like, I'm confused. I don't understand why you're showing me these things. I don't know what this is about. Why am I being shown these things? Now, after all that's said and done, I'm still like, I'm not comfortable. I don't go out there in public and I don't say I'm a abductee or a contactee or an experiencer, because I don't know if I trust my own memories. Now I have a lot of the signs and, weird dreams, and I had fearful events, and I did have that crazy night on the ranch where all the lights went out and the hum sound and the brighter than the sun out of the boys' windows and that whole thing. And that night when I got home, I was paralyzed for a short time and I couldn't speak. My words were jumbled and I had a very bad migraine headache event. Now, I don't know if I had lost of time that night. I was so young that I don't remember, but I wasn't alone. My sister was there. The three boys were there. My mother was there. So if I disappeared for a while, I don't know. I don't have any memory of that. I don't have any memory of being on board a craft, or, you know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
So even those came out of hypnosis, I still question it. So I feel hypnosis can be beneficial, and I find it interesting, and I know it's helped a lot of people, but I don't know if I trust what came out of my mouth. I don't.
Oh, I understand that, because I've gone through hypnosis, and you're presented with a story that's so absurd.
Yeah.
And then it's outside the boundaries of your own, your own memories. It's like it's a memory that's been retrieved not through normal means, let's say. Yeah, I know just what it feels like to be struggling with those kinds of memories.
Right.
And and this is what I did. And this comes right back to Leo. Like, I had a hypnosis session that was, wow, did it go over the top? And it went way stranger, way further than I ever would have expected. Mm-hmm. And at the end, I had to say, like, I can't trust the story. Mm-hmm. Well, excuse me, I can't trust the experience as real, but it's a marvelous story.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful story. What can I learn? Like, if someone told it to me as a myth, what can I take away from that story as a piece of mythology, like my own personal mythology? So it doesn't have to literally happen, but I can, what lessons can I take away from that?
And I don't need to go into what, but basically the lesson would be for me is to proceed forward in the role I'm in, and proceed forward at a really high standard, of creativity, and a really high standard of let's say, ethical output. Mm-hmm. So that's what I learned from my experience. Yeah.
Right. And I would say the same thing happened for me as well. Like, what can I take from that? And that's to really appreciate how we are. To appreciate how bipolar we are and how we have these range of emotions and how artistic, and to really value that, And so I'm like, that's a good thing to do. And I would like to say too that Leo, going through that process with Leo is like going through hypnosis from the very best, right? So I learned so much from him, and he never asked leading questions. Mm-hmm. He never said, "Tell me about the UFO," or "Tell me about the aliens you saw." He wasn't like that. But what he would do, he would, as I'm going deeper and deeper, he'd ask, "What floor are you on? How deep are you?" And then as you're going through the process, he would give you little suggestions that aren't leading in any way, but just like, do you recognize what kind of shoes you're wearing? Or do you recognize the floor around you? Or do you recognize, but he wouldn't, and I like that. So, he would, do you smell anything? Those kind of things, but nothing ever leading. Did he do that with you as well?
So I never was successfully hypnotized by Leo. My hypnosis session came, I was working with Yvonne Smith during that. And so Leo attempted to hypnotize me. I was so nervous. I couldn't go under. I just kind of fidgeted. And at some point I said, this isn't going to work. I'm too tense.
Right.
And I tried to go with, do you know Barbara Lamb?
Yes.
I tried to do a hypnosis session with Barbara, and I couldn't go under. And then I did a session with Bud Hopkins, and I got some information from Bud, but it was interesting. It was stuff that I remembered consciously, but it was what happened when I was under. I just had a way I could tell the same story I remembered consciously and just tell it without self-censoring myself, if that makes sense, or self-editing myself. So it came out a little smoother, but really no new information. But when I went under did the thing with Yvonne, like, wow. Yeah. Wow. Did my whole world change.
Wow.
So, but I wanted to, and I trusted Leo implicitly. Mm-hmm. I knew he was not going to, he did not have an agenda,
right,
except for my better well-being. And as a clinician, he was looking to help me heal from the stresses and anxieties that I was dealing with connected to all this.
Right. And he's very good about that. Like, he's always like, only the best intentions, he really keeps you in a really positive, safe environment. And that's really important when you're dealing with traumatic events like these, because you don't know what kind of can of worm you're opening up. And he was really, really good at, making sure it was a positive and you were okay afterwards. And, what a relief that was to go through that process. And I'm really happy that I did that. It was a good thing.
Yeah. Leo ran a series of conferences in the 1980s.
He did.
Out of Laramie. I'm not sure how long those lasted. And I'm not sure if he was... Do you know when he actually left the University of Wyoming and then started his own practice?
I really don't know what year that was. I know I have his bio, but I don't have it in front of me. Yeah.
It must have been in the late 80s or mid 80s. Yeah. I don't have it off the top of my head. I could look that up.
Yeah.
But he never said anything bitter or anything like that about his time at the school. But he did say that there came a point when I just felt I needed to leave. And he didn't quite say it, but my strong sense was that he was getting some pushback from the school on the strangeness of his area of research.
Right. And there was even articles like I had mentioned when he'd go talk to the schools, some of the parents would shut him down. And, there was big controversies that, the districts wouldn't allow him to speak about this topic. And that made the papers and everything. So he really was a champion for, being open about what might be going on with, different people and that. And he took some heat for talking to middle schools and high schools and younger people, because I think people were afraid they were going to, it was a scary thing or a fearful thing. And I think he was really just trying to educate people on the possibilities of what could be out there in the universe. And he certainly didn't come at it with, malintent or trying to scare anybody,
Oh, and Laramie, Wyoming, in that corner of the West, is very, very conservative.
Yeah.
I could see him. I could see him making some waves.
Right. Yeah. For sure. Right.
So I have to say that I have not read the book from beginning to end. It is a wonderful book to skip around and just jump around and read a little bit here, read a little bit there. I'm guilty of that. So there's some total gems in there. And what I was struck by was kind of the arc of like the latter half of the 20th century. Like you'd get a letter from the 1950s and it would be next to a letter from the 1980s. And so you end up seeing like different chapters of UFO history through those letters. I mean, you must have some favorites and some gems that you found really rewarding when doing your research.
Yeah, I certainly do. And, like I said, it was a process of photographing letters and then going home and organizing them into folders and then reading them and going through that process. And I was kind of pulling out, if I thought it was fascinating and interesting, I thought others would too. And something I really enjoyed is each chapter of the book. So there's many different chapters, from ET descriptions, sightings, abductions, channeling the ETs. A whole chapter was dedicated because so many people wrote about, was this a dream or was this a memory?
Yes.
And I've experienced the same thing because there's people who was like, I dream every night, but there's one in particular, I just can't shake it. And I don't know, maybe it was an abduction experience. And that was so common that it's a whole chapter, letters from children. But for each chapter, I found an archival return letter from Leo that would speak on whatever the chapter was about. So in chapter 4 is on abductions. And I'm just going to read to you how the chapter starts with Leo's quote. So this is Leo's words. If one watches these abductees during their daily activity, one often sees them as obsessive compulsive or creative in their behavior. Contactees often act as if they were collaborators working with unseen entities who push, nag, congeal, and or encourage the contactees to complete a project or mission. Some contactees feel obliged to move to another area. Some begin reading about ancient civilizations. Some receive impressions or messages of scientific theories or devices. Some receive impressions or messages on future events. If one observes UFO contactees over a span of years, then one can offer another hypothesis. These persons are changing from planetary persons to cosmic citizens. Leo, June 7th, 1980. So in 1980, he's already seen, right, that contactees are kind of being awoken to be into the galactic world.
Yes. Yeah, there was another one then there where he replied to, it was just a little aside. I'll make sure to read it correctly, where he said,
I think you are on the right track in linking ESP to UFOs. In fact, I would go further, suspecting that all close contact UFOs are paranormal, some sort of super psychokinesis. This hypothesis easily accommodates an extraterrestrial agent who remains at home on some distant planet, thus avoiding the difficulties of physical space travel. The often comic aspect of the UFO contact I would explain as the naive attempts of Earthlings to interpret alien signals using an earthly thesaurus. This was from Leo. It was found in Box 33, and it was dated April 7th, 1975.
But in that same chapter, abductions, so this is from box 20, and I put in the book the boxes and the folders. So if anybody is ever in Laramie and they choose to read all, the actual reports, the big file, they know exactly where to go and where it is. So it's box 20, folder 31. It's out of Herod, maybe it's Herod, Herod, Illinois.
Yep.
Dated March 13th, 1981. And this is one of my favorite little gems I found in the archives. We've all heard of the 1975 Travis Walton abduction, right? Mm-hmm. In Snowflake, Arizona. So I'm reading this letter And this gentleman states, and I'm just going to read his letter to Leo. He says, I am a senior citizen now and not educated to your level. I have been a country preacher for many years now, but I am sure of the truth of these space beings. 40 years ago, any story told about meeting UFOs would have been considered insanity. I would like to share with you an event that I have never been able to share before. It was a year between 1931 and 1934. Our bus had run through a small place that I believed to be Snowflake, Arizona. We rolled a short distance into the countryside and the bus came to a stop. To the left of us was a small clearing of woods, where a small ship rested with lights gleaming and changing. The lights were mostly blue, just like Travis Walton.
Mm-hmm.
I said to the driver, I believe I'll go over and see what it is. As I approached the craft, it was larger than I had thought. We hear that often too, right? It's like bigger one. And the blue light seemed to draw me in and had a calming effect on me. A door opened and I was inside. There were several little people on the craft that I saw. They may have been more in another room. I was kept in the room I entered. They motioned for me to get on a padded table, like you find in a doctor's office. I obeyed and became submissive, and with little fear, they felt my arms, legs, and over my body. There was one that was a woman. She was more delicate than the others. Suddenly, I fell into a deep sleep. When I awoke, one of them was standing near me. He motioned for me to follow him. I dressed, and he hurried me into a room where I saw several men. One of them pointed skyward. I looked up, and through a glass I saw other spaceships flying a great distance above us. I never heard any of them speak. They just looked at each other and motioned to each other and to me. I believe I was taken to outer space. I know I was put into a deep sleep. The next thing I saw was a glimpse of high buildings to our left as we went along. The buildings were square and greenish in color. Then I was asleep again, and now I believe it was for several days. So he goes on, basically, the next thing he knows, he was back on the bus, and it was coming to a grinding stop. And I was standing at the very spot where I had left the bus. I started talking to the bus driver about leaving the bus yesterday. He informed me that I'd been gone for several days. As we went into town, I told the driver that no one would believe this was happening, and we might as well try to forget it. So, he claims he had missing time for a couple days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what was the date on that one?
This letter was written in 81, but he claimed his experience was in the early 30s.
Wow.
Yeah. Isn't that fascinating?
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, it's hard to go back and vet these stories, and that's how you kind of have to take some of these as stories, right? I don't know if this was ever investigated, or, it sounds to me like he was just writing Leo to get it off his chest, that he really never spoke about this experience before until he wrote Leo that letter.
But that's the role of people looking into this. You have to be open-minded, and you have to be careful not to be too judgmental
right.
of what the information you're receiving. Basically cast a wide net.
Right.
And maybe in that in the book, there's some accounts, and I say this about my own book, the Messengers, where I was referencing hundreds of accounts of people who had owl and UFO experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I would rather have a few false tales in, because I had a wide net, than have a narrow net and then lose sight of the entirety of the picture. Because I feel like if there's a spectrum, there's these outlying events
mm-hmm.
that many UFO researchers will dismiss outright because they're too weird.
Right.
But I think we are going to learn more by focusing on those outlying events and those things that are too strange. We're going to learn more, and we're going to have a richer picture of what the entirety of the phenomena actually truly is.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also, it says a lot just about our own perceptions, our own beliefs, and, our own imaginations, and why somebody might choose to believe in something like that, right? And Dr. Leo Sprinkle's Soul Samples talks about that. He talks about trauma, and, because there was a big argument that, well, these ET stories or these abductions are just people that have had a lot of trauma, and it's their way to feel connected, or, there's somebody else there for them. And he speaks to that and did a lot of research and surveys about that very topic. So, I think he as a psychologist, he looks at all of that and has really done a fascinating job at sorting out some of those skeptical people that would say, well, everybody's just crazy and there's nothing to any of this. And he makes a really good argument through his work that states otherwise.
Yeah. I worked with Bud Hopkins in around 2008 and 2009. And I was at his home. He was very ill at that time. He was suffering from cancer. And I was going to be hypnotized. I went to his home alone to be hypnotized. I was in New York City. I used to live in New York City, so I have a lot of friends there. So I was staying in a friend's house. And I knocked on his door. And when he opened the door, he looked very weak. And he said, Mike, I don't have it in me to do a hypnosis session today. Let's just sit and talk. So I sat and talked with him for like 3 hours.
Oh, wow. How cool.
I wish I would have recorded this conversation. But Bud had a very different mindset and a very different way of looking at the phenomena than Leo does or did. And Bud and Leo were almost the same age. They were just a few years apart. They were born just a few years apart. So Bud had a very, I don't want to say a dark view of it, but he felt that the beings were up to no good. Like nothing good was going to come from the contact experience. And then he also like really listened to me, Bud did. And at the end of our time together, he walked me to the hall and the door, and I walked myself out down the stairs and walked out to the street. But before we left, we stood there in the hall, and he gave me this big bear hug, Bud did, and slapped me on the back. And he said to me, he said, "You live near Leo, right?" And I said, yeah. And he said, "Leo would be a good fit for you." I said, yeah, so he knew, like he sized me up in a way, and he was correct. And I had already worked with Leo, and I only saw Leo a few times after that. But that really felt good that Bud, who in his public face kind of clashed with Leo, but privately fully recognized that he was doing good work, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that was some of the really interesting correspondence, and I found fascinating. I mean, the letters from experiencers was one thing, but to see him, because you could go to the archives and look at his correspondence between him and Bud Hopkins, or, him and Linda Howe and other colleagues, and to see how they were talking to one another, and the great respect, J. Allen Hynek, and the Christmas cards, and just the banter between them. I think whatever the view, even Phil Klass, even though it kind of got a little heated, and that's kind of fun because Leo, like you said, he had a tough side. He stood his ground. He was not a pushover. He was not a softie. He took a lot of heat, and he stood his ground. But I think he was nonetheless respected across the board by all people because of the approach he took, with everybody, the respect and the dignity to hear you out, even though he disagreed with you, and he would stand his ground. But yet at the same time, he was kind. And I think we can all learn a lesson from that, And
that kindness goes a long way. Wow.
Yeah.
So he's a kind, big-hearted. I think that might be a better way to say it than kindness. He was a big-hearted giant of a presence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, love and light, and his belief in reincarnation, and we're here to learn and grow our souls, then you're going to try and wake up every morning and do the best job that you can for everybody, right? To be as kind as you can. And I think he lived by that. And that's, I always look to him on the days that I'm like, feeling a little exhausted and questioning why I'm doing whatever. I think of that phone call from Leo from beyond saying, get up and just go do it and do the best you can and be a champion and an ear for other people. Because I know what it meant to me, and it means that much to other people. When you go through things you don't understand, it's very helpful to have just somebody willing to just listen. At the end of the day, we all just want to be heard and validated and respected.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, in one of the last chapters, chapter 15 of the book, is your final thoughts as the researcher.
Right. I haven't read it in a few years, so I'd be interested to see what I say now. But actually, I mean, it just kind of sums up what I just kind of said. And my final thoughts is what, Leo's words of wisdom is it's the journey and the people and the friendships and the experiences that we have, And I think about that every time, just like this last Labor Day weekend, going out to, San Luis Valley and meeting the King family. And it's just, I try to just take it in. Because at the end of the day, our time here is pretty short, and I just try to think of him and his lighthearted yeehaw, and just go with it and have a good time and not worry about. I get sometimes caught up in documents and trying to find the answers and making all these connections, and that's important, and I still want to try and do that. But at the end of the day, it's really just taking in the moment and taking in the people, and that's what Leo did.
Yeah. Yeah. What are you up to these days?
Started my Rocky Mountain Ranch research, which is basically I'm starting a YouTube channel, and I have my website, which you can go to RockyMountainRanchResearch.org or katiepaige.net, and you can kind of see what I'm up to there. But I'm kind of taking people along with me as I go investigate the Rocky Mountain Ranch High Strangeness, which is featured on Beyond Skinwalker on History Channel, and doing interviews. I'm working with Jeff McBurney at Mount Wilson Ranch, which is another interesting thing. Dr. Leo Sprinkle, in the 80s and the 90s, worked with a really interesting team of people, and we have photographs of Dr. Sprinkle out there at Mount Wilson Ranch that was owned by Bob Bigelow when he owned Skinwalker Ranch. So here we have a photograph of Leo Sprinkle and Bob Bigelow and Linda Moulton Howe and Hal Putoff and Kit Green. And, I'm kind of like, Leo, what were you up to there? And I know, Russell Targ was out there. So we have these RV people remote viewing and out there at Mount Wilson Ranch. And I'm always curious, he was deeper into these topics than we think he was. He was out there on location investigating some of these really important locations around the world. So he was a part of that as well. But so I'm visiting those locations, and just like I said, we just went to Rawlins, and I'm kind of re-investigating and looking at the connections between some of these elk hunting cases and UFOs and these boxes that Carl Higdon had in common and the Rocky Mountain Ranch. And so it's fun to kind of do this podcast and take people along with me on the journey. So that's what I'm up to, staying busy.
Where is the Mount Wilson Ranch? Is that in Colorado?
It's in Nevada. It's really close to Area 51. And It's interesting. They're digging things up underground there. And Jeff McBurney's really focused on that. But there's a definite Howard Hughes connection there.
Oh, interesting.
There's a lot of the areas. And we think, there's the runway really close to Mount Wilson Ranch. So it's interesting. You tie all these people together, and you have to wonder what they were up to. And there's possibly even things buried out there at Mount Wilson Ranch. I know Jeff's doing his due diligence digging on that property, and they actually pulled up a really ornate concrete, almost like something you would see in France or something, this ornate, well-carved light post. And then at Contact in the Desert, I was sitting on a panel with Earl Grey Anderson. Do you know Earl?
I know Earl, yeah.
Yeah, and he's up on the panel just talking about how his mother worked for Howard Hughes. She was blindfolded and taken to this undisclosed location, put in an elevator shaft that went very fast. She said she got butterflies in her stomach, but it went underground. There was a hair salon, and there was like a whole city underground, but they never really knew the location. And then his mother worked for Howard Hughes, and then Mount Wilson Ranch has this underground void that they're trying to dig, and these artifacts with the Howard Hughes runway right by the ranch. So put two and two together, I'm like, I think I know where your mother was taken, Earl Grey Anderson, Mount Wilson Ranch.
Wow.
So it's these connected people, and Leo was out there. He was a part of that. So all these mysteries and all these clues, it keeps Katie going, Good.
Well, it keeps me going too.
Yeah.
Oh, this felt wonderful, just to honor his work and his personality and his kindness.
Yeah.
And his big-heartedness.
It really did. And I hope he's never forgotten. He touched so many people. And I know for me personally and for you, Mike, he will never be forgotten. And he's just a light that keeps me going,
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful time to have this in-depth, really meaningful conversation for me.
Yeah, thank you so much, too. It felt good to talk about Leo.
Good. Thank you.
This is Mike chiming in after the editing. I needed to do this show. I stopped doing my podcast, The Unseen, for Whitley's site in the summer of 2021, and Leo died a few months later. I heard the sad news from a post on Katie's Facebook page, and I contacted her right away, and we talked on the phone. She told me about Leo and his final days. She also shared how wonderful he was and how he helped her and how much she admired him, both personally and in his dedication to his work. I said, we need to do a show dedicated to Leo's memory. Well, that took well over 2 years to finally get around to recording this episode. I said it during our conversation, but I'll say it again. This show was the reason I started my old podcast again. I simply needed to talk about Leo and to hear Katie talk about his final days. There's a photo of Leo and Katie in the show notes on the Patreon page. You heard me cautiously ask her about posting this image. Leo is seen lying in his hospital bed, and he looks so frail. But he is smiling, that big, genuine smile. That image so beautifully represents Leo and his radiant energy. During the show, Katie asked me if I knew that Leo channeled, and I said yes. He had channeled for me a few times, and he did it on our 2011 audio interview. I've included a link to that show in the show notes, as well as on the Patreon site. It is listed as a classic from the archives, and it can also be easily found on any podcast streaming site by searching Hidden Experience plus Leo Sprinkle. I feel so blessed to have met that man and to have been able to spend so much time with him and to feel the power of his optimism and encouragement. And one more thing, the audio quality of my voice was an issue on this episode. I did something that happens very rarely. At the beginning of the interview, I had my mic all set up, but it wasn't plugged in, so I was being recorded from the internal mic built into my computer, and I didn't realize what I had done until listening to the audio files after the recording. Fortunately, I have an app that can clear out most of the room tone, and it greatly improved the audio, but it's not perfect. I sound hollow and flat all throughout the recording. Yet, you may have noticed this. At one point, I read an excerpt from one of Leo's letters. I recorded this during the editing and then plugged it into the conversation. And you can clearly hear my voice jump from that flat, hollow tone to a more rich, normal tone, hopefully like you're hearing my voice right now. To you, the listeners, I want this show to feel clean and professional. I strive for quality, though I'm only one person and there's only so much I can do. But hopefully the clarity in the audio will help my show rise a little bit above what I consider the norm in podcasting, which can often sound pretty bad. For anyone listening, I encourage you to sign up at my Patreon site. Presently, the prices are very low, and I do offer free membership, and nearly everything is included in that free category. That may change at some point, but in the short term, I am happy to offer the show for free, although there are some extras that will be unavailable unless you are a paying member. Once again, this show was such an honor and something I felt so deeply that I needed to do. Peace and strength, and thank you so much. Bye now. Owls are somehow connected to UFOs. I don't say that lightly. After over a decade of obsessive investigation, I am convinced of this connection. As strange as it may seem, people are seeing owls in the highly charged moments of a UFO sighting, and within the challenging memories of UFO abduction. This mystery has been the focus of my research. My name is Mike Cleland, and I have explored these connections in my book, The Messengers. At its core, this book is simply a collection of stories, and each is a remarkable real-life experience. The Messengers is also my own story of how owls played a role in my life. It's an exploration into the deeply personal questions that arose from my own contact experiences. Whitley Strieber said this about The Messengers.
It's a wonderful book because it's a book that advances us in consciousness. It advances us. It takes us from where we were before we started reading it to a new place in terms of understanding the close encounter experience. I can name just on the fingers of one hand the number of books that actually do that.
The Messengers is the first in a trilogy of books, and each volume explores a deeper aspect of the UFO mystery. Stories from the Messengers, owls, UFOs, and a deeper reality. This is the second in the series, and it tells a series of 19 real-life stories, each with UFOs and owls. The third is Hidden Experience, a memoir of owls, synchronicity, and UFO contact. This is my own story, my emotional journey of coming to terms with very challenging memories and experiences. All my books are available on Amazon in paperback, ebook, and as audiobooks. Hey, this is Mike, and I have been pretty upfront with saying that I will not put advertisements in my podcast. And then I follow that up with, except if it's for my books. So what you just heard was very clearly an advertisement, and it's for my books. And if you have read or listened to any of my books, I would be incredibly grateful if you could take a moment and leave a review or rate it on Amazon. This one simple act, more than anything, truly helps a self-published author like me to get the word out, allowing other readers to discover my work. So let me add a few more things. If you enjoyed this episode and my other episodes, and you would like to support the show, please consider joining me on Patreon. Your contributions will help keep this podcast ad-free, and you always have the option to join my Patreon site as a free member. All my shows will remain free. There are extras for paying members, things like behind-the-scenes updates and an occasional chat with the host. That's me, and you can do that with the other members, but that will be for paying members only. If you like the show, please help spread the word. Share the podcast with your friends, leave a review, or post about it on social media. Your support means so much to me. Bye now.